The classical period in Greek history begins in 480 BC with the defeat of the Persians. This is a rather interesting period in Greek history. There was a fairly protracted war, a really quite nasty war between the Persians and the Greeks. And this included the destruction of Greek cities by the Persians who had invaded, women being sold into slavery and all the men slaughtered in some places. And it culminates with a naval victory for the Greeks at Salamis. And the Greek city-states actually band together for the first time, really. They all group together and fight to shake off this common foe, the ancient Persians. And the period that immediately follows this, the classical period, is a period where we see some of the greatest works of Greek literature created. It's a period in time where we see such famous characters as Sophocles, as Pericles, as Aeschylus, as quite a few other very important and well-known Greek artists, politicians, and of course writers from the period. So in addition, the famous Greek historian Herodotus also is from this period in time. So this is a real high point in ancient Greek civilization. When we look at art in the ancient Greek world during the classical period, what we see is we see that the figures in sculpture in particular really change fairly dramatically. We'll be looking at a comparison here in just a moment of what this really looks like, but in general, during the classical period, we see that the human figure in statuary tends to be much more naturalistic. The individuals tend to move like real people, and they're also often idealized godlike figures. We'll also see that we kind of lose some of that archaic frontality. You know, during the archaic period, the figures have a tendency to be very frontal. They face outward. Whereas during the classical period, we often see, particularly in sculptural groups, that the figures face inward or are more concentrated on their actions rather than engaging with the outside. When we talk about the classical period, we can actually also subdivide this period a little bit as well. The classical period can be typically broken down into three major categories, chronologically speaking, and these are the severe classical, the earliest period, the high classical, and then this is followed by what we just referred to as the 4th century. And so that's the period in time really just before we have the Hellenistic period, and that's really kind of the late classical. So when we take a look at the high classical period, we're going to see some pretty famous artworks, including some examples of architecture. We're going to start here, however, with taking a look at sculpture. And some of the best-known sculptors of this period in history include Praxiteles, Polykleitos, and Lysippos. And we'll be taking a look at works by these masters as we move on. So in our last discussion, we had talked about the Temple of Apphia at Aegina. And the Temple of Apphia at Aegina is a great example of a late archaic period temple. It's beautifully balanced. We have these much more slender Doric columns compared to some of the earlier examples that we've seen. And it is a temple that was completed about 490 BC, so very much kind of the tail end of the archaic period. And this temple was decorated with statuary, including pedimental sculpture on both sides. So we had an east pediment and a west pediment. Well, what happens that's interesting, though, is that the east pediment of the temple is damaged. And so the statuary, all of the sculptural work, is replaced about 10 years later. And when this happens, what's really kind of fascinating is that we see a tremendous shift, a difference, in this very short period in time when we look at and compare and contrast the statuary from the two sides of the Temple of Apphia. And so in our last discussion, we had an opportunity to see a dying warrior. And here we have another dying warrior, this one from the opposite side. And it really is kind of almost a mirror image in terms of pose, in terms of content, but the similarities really are outweighed by some pretty significant differences in handling. When we look at this example of this dying warrior from the east pediment, one of the things that you'll notice is that he doesn't have that twisted, convoluted, unnatural pose. We don't have this image of a strangely crossed leg and a twisted torso facing out at the viewer. You'll see here that this man is much more focused on what's going on inside the composition with him personally than in directing himself outward with a goofy, archaic grin and engaging the viewer. So archaic statuary, the earlier statuary, again, is very frontal, tends to face out to the viewer, whereas classical statuary looks inward. And what we see here is what is intended to reflect a real person experiencing a real event, the pain, the anguish of death. This man is propping himself up with his shield, trying to maintain some handhold, some grip on life as he dies here in battle. So it's a tremendous difference in terms of naturalism. It's much more realistic in terms of anatomy and pose, and also, again, it's rendered in a way that focuses really on the individual and represents this as a real person. Here in this image, we can see a comparison of the two, and again, you can see that there's a lot of similarities in terms of what is represented, but the manner in which these two are represented is really quite strikingly different. And again, these are only 10 or maybe 20 years apart, and these are from the same temple, which is, again, a really kind of a very instructive comparison. So when we talk about architecture during the classical period, there are some interesting examples for us to discuss as well. Greek classical architecture is pretty incredible stuff, especially when we get to a couple of the later examples here. But in general, when we talk about classical architecture, it tends to be very well balanced, precise architecture. The best example of this, the most highly refined of these really that we can look at, is the Parthenon, which was commissioned by Pericles to be built or rebuilt really on the Acropolis. And we can also talk, when we get there, we'll talk about about Phidias, who was responsible for the sculptural decoration and the overall program of design, and the architects, Ictinus and Callicrates. But these structures, particularly like the Parthenon, tend to really defy traditional geometry. There are deliberate optical illusions. There is a real lack of straight lines. We look at these buildings and we assume or think that everything we're looking at is straight and linear and right angles, and it's not. It's much more complex than that. And these were done for very deliberate reasons, again, that we'll kind of explore when we get there. The best known early example, or most famous, probably most important example of early classical architecture really no longer exists in any kind of recognizable state, and that was the Temple of Zeus at Olympus. And when we looked at the Temple of Zeus, at Olympia rather, the temple was a Doric temple. We know in terms of looking at the remains, a rough idea really of its plan and elevation. But the best example we can look at today to kind of help us really get an idea of how it probably appeared is the Temple of Hera II. The Temple of Hera II is located at Paestum in Italy, quite close actually to Temple of Hera I, which we looked at previously. And both the Temple of Zeus and the Temple of Hera follow a similar plan and elevation to the Temple of Apphia at Aegina. But the Temple of Zeus was really considered to be the first great monument of art and architecture during the classical period. And again, looking here at the Temple of Hera, we can really get a pretty good idea of what it probably looked like. Now, while the temple itself no longer really survives, much of its statuary does. And we do have some pretty remarkable examples of surviving work from the east pediment of the Temple of Zeus. So, Olympia, of course, is the location of the Greek games, of the Olympics. And when we look at this temple, we see some images, some scenes that are really quite appropriate to this, because what we're looking at here in the fragmentary statuary from the pediment references a very famous race, a chariot race in particular. And what we're talking about here is the race between Oenomaus and Peplos. And the story behind this is really kind of a fascinating tragedy. So King Oenomaus was aware of a prophecy. There's a story, this prophecy, that if his daughter Hippodamia married, that he'd die. So obviously King Oenomaus doesn't really want his daughter to get married. So whenever someone would try to marry his daughter, a suitor would come along and propose to marry her. He had a challenge for them. Basically, the challenge was pretty simple. If you can beat me in a chariot race, you can marry my daughter. But if you lose, you die. And so the really kind of the interesting part about this, though, you see, is Onomaios never lost. Onomaios had divine horses. His father was Ares, and so he had these kind of magical horses, and he would engage in these chariot races with these suitors from Olympia to Corinth, and they always lose, they always die, and he's obviously still around. So something happens, though. Something changes. Another suitor comes along, and his name is Pelops. And Pelops, well, he basically cheats. What he does is he bribes the king's groom, this guy named Myrtilos, and he basically says, I'm going to pay you, and what I want you to do is sabotage the king's chariot so that it falls apart. Well, he does. He sabotages the chariot. They have the race. The king dies. Right? So prophecy comes true. And but what Pelops does, though, is rather than pay Myrtilos, he drowns him, kills him. And as Myrtilos is being slain, he curses Pelops, curses his entire family. So you may remember from some of our other discussions the results of this particular curse, because Pelops' son is Atreus, and Atreus is then murdered. Atreus' son is Agamemnon, and Agamemnon has to sacrifice his daughter. And then it goes on and on and on from there. Then Agamemnon is slain by his wife and her lover, and then their child, Orestes, ends up coming back and killing his mother and his father and gouging out his eyes. And so it's just a big, whole, ugly, long series of stories that all really come back to this one single moment in history. And we see that here. That's what's about to happen. When we look at this pediment, it is all of that horrible mess encapsulated in one brief little moment. And the way that the artist has represented this here is really pretty striking. So if we take a moment and we look at some of the statuary a little more closely, you can see here in the center, we can see King Onomaios and his wife on one side, Pelops and Hippodamia on the other, and they all look very calm. They're just, prepared for the race, and they don't seem to suspect anything. But there's one figure who seems to know what's about to happen. And it's this one older man here. He's a seer, like a prophet. So he can see into the future. He knows what's about to happen. And he has this look of horror on his face as he realizes what's about to occur. And so this one image here, this one little figure off to the side kind of gives us this clue, this hint of what really is coming. So in addition to the very famous statuary from the pediment of the temple to Zeus at Olympia, we also have some pretty remarkable examples of metopes. So a metope, again, is one of these panels, a sculptural decoration that would fit in between the triglyphs when we're looking at the Doric order. And this one you're looking at here is quite large. It's about 5'3" in height, and also from the temple of Zeus. And the metopes from the temple of Zeus, originally, of course, many of these no longer really survive, but what they represented, what they showed, was the labors of Heracles, the 12 labors of Heracles. So again, totally appropriate for a temple at Olympia, the source of the Olympic Games. So in this particular example, we see Heracles here holding up the world with the help of Athena. And you can see on the right-hand side, Atlas is bringing to him the golden apples of the Hesperides. And Athena is here wearing a traditional peplos, the belted kind of woolen garment that they would wear. And again, you can see the contrast here with the archaic style. This style here is often, again, what we refer to as the severe style. We have these kind of, almost grimacing faces in many occasions, and we also have this very severe effect in terms of the dramatic and idealized anatomy of the individual characters that we're looking at. The Temple of Zeus, by the way, also held one of the 7 original wonders of the world, which no longer survives, and it was a massive statue of Zeus created by Phidias. Phidias is another character we'll be talking about a little bit later, as he was responsible for the decorative program and really much of the program at the Parthenon and at the Acropolis. But there was this enormous work that he had created, this image of Zeus, which was in fact a chryselephantine statue. And chryselephantine refers to the materials. This means that it was made up out of gold and ivory. So looking next here, when we're talking again about the classical period in history, there's a really important innovation, something that comes along that we see for the first time. That's one of the most important innovations of the Greeks when it comes to art and statuary, and this particular innovation is something that is lost after the fall of the Roman Empire, really, and doesn't reemerge again until the Renaissance. And it's all about posture. It's really all about how the figure is represented. And it's a term that today we use an Italian term to describe, and the word is contrapposto, which means counterpose or counterpoise. And what this really simply refers to is that if you're standing there naturally in one place, you generally don't stand with your weight evenly distributed across both feet. Most people have a tendency to kind of shift to one hip or the other. And when you do this, one leg is tense and supports your weight while the other is more relaxed. The angle of your pelvis changes and it shifts your whole body. And so the Greeks were the first people to see this and render it. And the example that we see here, the Kritos boy from the Acropolis, is the first known example of this in history. This is another one of these examples that was buried when the Persians sacked the Acropolis and then rediscovered later. And the sculptor, Kritos, is believed to be the first person to really capture this. And this is one of the most important works in Greek sculpture. It's not a very large sculpture. It's only about 2'10" in height. But this is, again, the first time that we see this very subtle tilt and twist of the pelvis. And this is a so much more realistic and naturalistic way to render the distribution of weight as compared to anything that we've seen in the past. So again, during the classical period, we continue to see these innovations by the Greeks develop, and we see their refinement. The example that we're looking at here is a very rare example in a lot of ways. Many of the best known examples of Greek statuary that we look at and talk about today are actually Roman copies of those original works, because many of the original works no longer survive. A lot of the bronzes were simply melted down to make weapons or other things later, and do not persist to this day. But this is an unusual example in that this is an original Greek bronze, and there are very few of these around. The reason that this one survives is because it was actually found by a diver in the water off the coast of Riace while investigating a shipwreck, looking at the cargo of an ancient ship that sank during antiquity. There were two found there. This is one of a pair, and after several years of restoration, this was the result. And this one simply is known as one of the Riace warriors. But it was underwater in saltwater for about 2,000 years. And as you can see, it's still in pretty good shape, given the fact that it had been underwater, submerged in those kind of conditions for so long. It has inlaid eyes, silver teeth and eyelashes, copper lips and nipples, and is really an astonishing example of Greek craftsmanship. Here, the shift in weight, the contrapposto, is much more pronounced than we see in the Kritos boy. The arms are completely freed from the body. We see the head turning. This would have probably originally had some other items with it. It probably would have had a helmet, a shield, a spear, and these, of course, no longer are with us today. There's a detail again of this Riace warrior, and you can see the inlay work and the use of other materials to make, for example, again, the lips and the eyes. But this would have been created using a process known as lost wax casting. And this is a fairly complicated technique where a clay original is created, covered in wax, and then through a complicated process, this is essentially replaced with molten bronze by creating a complex mold. And these molds are single-use only, so you had to complete the original entirely out of clay, build up the wax, encase that in clay again, and basically melt out the wax and then replace it with the bronze. Another one of these fairly unusual examples of surviving Greek bronzes can be found here. This is another example that was found in the sea off of the coast of Greece. And this one is really quite large. This guy is about 6'10" in height. And this is probably either Zeus or Poseidon. In that hand that is upraised, we probably originally would have found either a trident or a lightning bolt, either of the two. And of course, depending upon which one it was, would have told us which god this represented. But we don't know for certain. It's probably Zeus. But there are some interesting things to note about this one, by the way. If you take a moment, look at the arms. Try to envision the arms being lowered to his sides, and you'll notice something a little strange. The proportions here, the length of the arms, is a little off, a little bit long. So if you kind of envision him lowering his arms down to his sides, they're coming down pretty close to his knees. And so again, during the classical period, while we do see some tremendous advances in the Greek understanding of proportions, we do still sometimes, on occasion, see some things that aren't quite as accurate, as we'll see in later cases. You'll also notice that this statue, like the one before it, doesn't really look like bright, shiny bronze, as you might expect. Metals like bronze and copper, when left out and exposed to the elements, will oxidize. But rather than rusting, like you might see in iron or steel, these metals develop what's called a patina. It's almost it really is a protective surface over the top. And these are usually bluish or greenish in color, and are often considered to be really quite beautiful. And so sometimes the patina really, as in a case like this, is really a valuable part of the aesthetic experience. So moving on here to another very famous example. This one is a statue that, if you look at carefully, you will come to pretty quickly realize is not an original Greek bronze or an original Greek marble work either, really, but in fact a Roman copy. And there's a couple things here that kind of clue us into the fact that this is a reproduction. One of these is that the original here probably would have been designed a little differently. You can see that in this statue, which is called the Discobolos by the famous sculptor Myron, we have this tremendous sense of movement and this explosive rotation of the figure. But if you look behind him, you can see a tree trunk. And this looks really, really out of place. And the sculptor designing this originally probably would not have ever included that, would have found a way to work around it or done something different. But this is a copy, again, a marble copy, a Roman copy. It was created after a bronze original. And in the bronze original, the trunk would not have been necessary. Just due to the nature of the material, bronze is much stronger, and you would not have needed to use this additional support in that way. This is another great example of a key concept when we talk about Greek art as well. And that's the concept of idealism. And when we look at Greek statuary, we almost always see that the people are represented as perfected, ideal individuals. The musculature is perfect. There's not a scrap of fat on them. They're all beautiful, perfect people. And this sense of idealism is once again some of the things that we see and is really emphasized in Greek art in particular. But the Romans, as I mentioned, were very interested in Greek art, and the Greek artisans often just could not produce enough work to satisfy Roman patrons. And so we often see that sometimes lower quality copies were mass-produced in Rome or other places as a way to kind of to meet this demand. And so while it's unfortunate that the original by Myron does not survive, it is rather fortunate for us, however, that we do have examples like this, these Roman copies, that at least give us some good idea of what this famous work probably originally looked like. Another example of a lost Greek original that we only know through a Roman copy can be seen here in the Doryphoros. This is a really famous statue, a really important statue that was created by Polykletos. The statue actually has several different names. Sometimes you'll hear it called the Doryphoros. Sometimes you'll hear it called the spear bearer. And by the way, those two words are synonymous. They mean the same thing. And then sometimes you'll also hear it called the canon. And I'll explain what that means in a second here. But first, let's talk a little bit about its provenance. This copy, this Roman copy, was preserved because it was found at Pompeii. Pompeii is a Roman city that was buried by volcanic ash in 79 AD. And we'll be looking at Pompeii pretty carefully later when we get to the Romans. But the original bronze was created about 450 to 440 BCE. And this example here is about 6'11". And so it's a really large, greater than life-size example. We can again see here some things that are utilized probably because it's marble rather than bronze, such as the post, the trunk sticking up out of the back to support it, and also this kind of marble strap which extends from the hip to the hand to support the arm. And again, that would not have existed if we were looking at and talking about a bronze original. So the reason this is called a canon, canon, as we know, is a set of conventions for the human figure. And we see that when we look at Egyptian art. We see how the canon changes later when we look at archaic Greek, for example. Well, this artist, Polykletos, decided to create an example of a human figure that represented perfection in terms of proportion. And this is not based, it's not sculpted from observation off of a real person. It is instead a mathematical construct. And that's important to understand here. This particular work, again, it's not based off of observation of a real person, but instead it is a set of mathematical proportions placed into stone, or in his case originally into bronze, that were intended to represent the ideal human proportions. So that's why it's called the canon, because it was intended to be this symbol of perfection. It's also a really interesting exercise in the contrasts of symmetric or asymmetrical balance, really, in terms of the pose. We have some parts of the pose that are very, very engaged, and some parts that are very relaxed. Some parts that are flexed, and some parts that are completely loose and unengaged. So when we take a look here, one of the things that you kind of can see, if you take a look on the left-hand side of the figure, for example, you can see how the left leg, at least his right leg, but in our view on the left side, is weight-bearing currently. It's carrying the weight of the body. You can see the strength of the leg coming up into the body. You can then also see how that tension then shifts to our right, to his left arm. On the opposite sides, we can see how his right arm, again on our left, is relaxed, and his left leg on our right is also relaxed. And so you have this counterpoise. You have this kind of S-like curve of tension that flows through the figure, again, emphasizing harmony and asymmetrical balance. And so this is really quite remarkable in terms of its linearity and its dynamic flexibility between the right and left side. So this brings us to Pericles. Pericles was a statesman, a politician, very important all-around guy in the ancient city of Athens. And Pericles is one of the most important people really talk about during this period in history because of his patronage. Pericles was responsible for paying for, really, the rebuilding of the Acropolis and the construction of the Parthenon, the Erechtheion, and all of the other really famous buildings and structures that we see there today. So a little bit of background, though, about Pericles and about the Acropolis. As we know from our earlier discussions, in 480 the Greeks defeat the Persians. And one of the things that kind of happens with this is all these different Greek city-states, as we mentioned previously, band together. They form something called the Delian League. And the Delian League is, again, this kind of group of city-states that are affiliated here really for the common purpose of defending against the Persians. But they end up taking a fairly significant sum of money, which is raised from all these different city-states, and it's all put together at the island of Delos, and it's put there as a way to it's for common defense. It's a fund for common defense, if you will. But anyway, Pericles manages to convince everybody that Athens should be in charge of these funds, and that Athens will use them responsibly, and on and on. Well, he manages to get control of the money, and then he uses it. He spends all of it rebuilding the Acropolis. So these famous buildings, the Parthenon, and all these things that we tend to associate with Greek idealism and with democracy and all these beautiful philosophical ideas, well, they were really actually all built using money that had been embezzled. So that's kind of an interesting little, side note here that a lot of people might not be aware of. So the object that we're looking at here, though, is what's called a Herm bust. And a Herm bust is basically a block of stone, if you will, with the bust coming up out of the top of it, so it's not a full sculpture. And this one is Again, a copy. It is a marble copy of what would have been a bronze original by Chrysalis. And this one is quite large too, even though this is only just a Herm bust like this, about 6 feet high. And this was done shortly after the death of Pericles and set up on the Acropolis. So here we have an aerial view of the Acropolis in Athens. Now, Acropolis, by the way, is a term that we generally use as a way to describe this particular site in Athens. But it is important to note that Acropolis is not really a proper noun, generally speaking. Acropolis just means high place or high city. And many of these ancient locations have an Acropolis, one of these places where you'd find the major temples and civic functions, etc. But the best known of these, of course, once again, is that of Athens, the Athenian Acropolis. So here in this aerial view, you can see that it is raised up on a hilltop. This location was, by the way, originally a Mycenaean fortification, a bastion up there, and some of the original Mycenaean walls still survive. But this location it was chosen as kind of a sacred site, and it's the site of a rather important series of historical events for the ancient Athenians. You see, early in the days of Athens, there was a contest by the gods, and this was about, well, which god or goddess would be the patron deity of the city. And so it came down really to two people. It came down to Poseidon and Athena. And so the question was, well, which one of these two would be the patron god or goddess? And so the contest between the two culminates with Poseidon striking a rock up here on the Acropolis with his trident, and a spring gushes forth. Okay, that's pretty cool. But then Athena causes an olive tree to grow and blossom and bear fruit on the site. And the citizens of Athens kind of realized, well, ooh, hey, olives, that we could make money with olives. And so they choose Athena, and Athena becomes the patron goddess. And of course, this is where the name Athens comes from. It's from Athena. And the site here, the location, the Acropolis, really is primarily devoted to Athena, although Poseidon's also included, and there are more than more than one version of Athena worship. We also have, Athena Nike, Athena Parthenos, Athena Promachos. So there's a couple different versions, really, of Athena that are also part of this complex that are worshipped in different ways. Looking here at this artist's reconstruction, at this drawing, you can also see the plan view. And some of the original structures no longer survive, but a couple of the major ones that do. You can see the plan there on the kind of the middle lower part there of the Parthenon itself. It's the most important, the largest of the temples. We'll also be looking at the Erechtheion, which is a kind of an oddly shaped building as well. The Propylaea, which is the entrance or gateway into the structure. And there's also a very small little Ionic temple that we'll be talking about, which is quite beautiful and has been reconstructed, and that is called the Temple of Athena Nike. So here's a model which gives us some idea of what the Acropolis probably would have looked like back during the mid-5th century or so, after it had been largely reconstructed. So these buildings weren't all built at one time. Some of them were never actually fully finished. For example, the Propylaea was never completed. War breaks out again in 431 BCE, and so the Propylaea wasn't finished. But we do have some other buildings there, of course, that were completed. Some of these, like the Erechtheion, the Temple of Athena Nike, were actually created after the death of Pericles, but these are probably part of the original plan. Some of the best known sculptors and architects and artisans of the period in history were brought here and utilized for the construction of these buildings. And we'll be talking about some of those architects as we look at some of the specific works. The history of this site is also quite colorful. Again, originally this was created and functioned as temples to these Greek gods and goddesses, but it has been used for other things too. During the medieval period, the Parthenon was actually a Byzantine church, and then later a Roman Catholic church. And in fact, part of the eastern end was knocked out in order to make an apse. When the Ottomans came in to Greece and conquered, they turned the structure into a mosque. And then something rather unfortunate happened to it in the 17th century. The Venetians laid siege to the Acropolis because this was in Turkish hands. And in the process of doing this, basically some artillery hit an ammunition dump, and the ammunition was being kept inside of the Acropolis, and it blew out the entire center. And so that's one of the reasons why it's in the state that it is today. So here's a view of this incredibly important and incredibly famous example of Greek architecture, of the Parthenon. And this is looking at it here from the front side. And so this was designed by two rather famous architects named Ictinus and Callicrates, although the famous sculptor Phidias oversaw much of the overall design and plan for the site. Most of the original colonnade, which is a peripteral colonnade, goes all the way around. Most of the original colonnade still stands and shows us really the ideal, the ultimate evolution of the Doric order in Greek architecture. The columns here, they're well spaced, they're slender, they're refined. They're really quite a contrast if we look back to the original Temple of Hera I at Paestum. Some other things about this that a lot of people don't realize. The shape of the Parthenon is actually really very irregular. If you were to kind of stand up and look across the stereobate and the stylobate, you would not see straight lines. It actually curves. The Parthenon steps are higher in the middle than they are on the ends. And if you were to look across the stylobate itself, across the whole center of the structure, you would see it's actually higher in the middle. It's very subtle. But one of the things that Greeks figured out is that when you have this big flat expanse, there's an optical illusion that occurs. And you have this illusion that it looks like what you're looking at is a little lower in the middle. Things optically appear to sag when they're perfectly level. And so they compensate for this by deliberately making it asymmetrical, by making the stereobate convex. So some other things that are pretty remarkable here too. They also knew that the columns on the exterior of a structure like this received more light. And because of the fact that they receive more light, they will look like they are thinner. And what they did to compensate for this is that the columns on the exterior corners are actually slightly larger in diameter than the other columns. Another really remarkable thing about this, and again, in order to compensate for optical illusions, these columns are not straight. They don't actually go straight up into the air. They're angled. They tilt inward slightly. It's said that if all of these columns were in fact extended up into the sky, they would meet at a point about 1.5 miles up, which is just incredibly remarkable. So all of these elements are curved. The architraves are curved. The columns are curved. None of it is really a simple, sharp, straight line. It is much more complex than that. And to take it even further, this temple is built using a very complex series of mathematical proportions. In fact, there is a mathematical formula, an algebraic formula that's used. And this can be seen, for example, if we look at and kind of count the total number of columns. So if we look at the front here, we can see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 columns across the front face. And if you were to look and count down the far side, down the flank, count the pteron, or the flank columns, what you would see is that there are 17. Okay, so that seems like an odd set of proportions, right? But if 8 is equal to x, then the flank is 2x plus 1. This same set of proportions can be found in the length to width ratio of the stereobate to stylobate, which is 4 to 9. It can be seen in the spacing of the columns as compared to the diameter of the columns. It is pervasive throughout the structure. And so this is an incredibly deliberate and incredibly complex system of mathematics that were used to describe and design this building. So as we know, the function, the primary purpose of a Greek temple is to hold a cult figure, a statue. Now, the original statue that stood within the Parthenon has been destroyed. It was destroyed by the Byzantines. But we have some idea of what it looked like based upon historical description, and we even have a couple of rather interesting recreations. What we're looking at here are a couple of those. The one on the left is from a museum in Toronto. The other is in Nashville. By the way, if you ever get to Nashville, there is a full-size reconstruction of the Parthenon. So what we do know is that this massive statue of Athena was 38 feet tall. It was chryselephantine, once again made of ivory and gold. And this was again created by Phidias. So there's some other interesting things going on here with this statue that we know from the descriptions as well. We see depictions of three famous battles. We see Centauromachi, Amazonomachy, and Gigantomachy. So that's the battle of Lapiths and Centaurs, the battle with the Amazons, and the battle of gods and giants. So these are represented on her sandals, on her shield, on the exterior of her shield rather, and then on the interior of her shield respectively. She holds a version of herself, by the way, in her right hand. And this is Athena Nike, which is a symbol of victory. So looking here, we're looking at one of the surviving metopes from the exterior of the Parthenon. And the exterior of the Parthenon, as we mentioned already, is Doric. It's a Doric temple on the outside. And here we have, it's somewhat fragmentary, but one of the surviving examples. And this shows us the battle of Lapiths and Centaurs. There were a total of 92 Doric metopes, and every single one of them was decorated with sculptural relief. These are about 4'8" in height, and so they give you some idea of scale. These, along with some of the other incredibly important and beautiful works of statuary from the Parthenon, by the way, were actually removed from Greece. There was an English lord named Elgin. Lord Elgin negotiated with the Turkish government, which was in control of Greece at the time, and basically took all of this stuff and had it sent back to England. And so the remaining pedimental statuary and the metopes and much of the relief from the Ionic relief of the Parthenon today can be found in the British Museum in London. And this is really quite controversial today. The Greeks would love to have this stuff back and believe it's their birthright. But then a lot of people also argue that if Elgin hadn't removed them from the country, that they wouldn't exist anymore. They would have been destroyed by the elements and by looters and by vandals. So, who knows? It's an interesting discussion and certainly a controversial one. So, at any rate, we again have these metopes that describe these heroic scenes. Here we have this victorious centaur rising up over a trampled Greek. It's very high relief. These figures almost come out from the frame. And again, these are just tremendous examples of the height, really, of the classical period in statuary. So, as we've mentioned, the original pediment has been largely removed and relocated to the British Museum in London, and some parts of these no longer survive. You'll notice that many of these figures are headless. It was actually kind of common practice that people who were visitors to the site back, many hundreds of years ago, it was difficult to steal an entire statue, but there were a lot of heads taken, and so it's fairly common that we see works like this, like these goddesses here, that are headless. So the east pediment of the Parthenon, which is what we're looking at here, depicts the birth of Athena. And part of this was destroyed quite badly when the center was knocked out to create an apse, when it was turned into a church. On the left-hand side, we have a figure who could be Heracles or Dionysus, possibly, observing while Helios and his horses rear up from the far left. And then we have the goddesses there on the right-hand side as well. There's a detail here of, again, either Dionysus or Heracles from the east pediment. And again, in classical tradition, we see this much more naturalistic pose, this introspective gaze as he's engaged with what's going on within the sculptural group rather than looking out at the audience. From the other side of the pediment here, we have three goddesses, either possibly Hestia, Dione, and Aphrodite, but we don't know for certain. But these are designed in a remarkable manner, a way that they lay back in here. You can very clearly see how these would fit down into the odd shape, into the corner of the pediment. We can also see this tremendous use of skill and virtuosity in the way that the draperies here are rendered. And unlike the earlier examples, when we look all the way back, for example, to the Peplus Chore, in those cases we see this garment, we see fabric, but we don't see any anatomy beneath it. But here we can see knees and legs and thighs and anatomy as it comes through the fabric, as the fabric drapes over it. We have these very intricate and complex forms that alternately reveal and conceal the mass of the body. It's really very clear that the artist here had a solid understanding, a very incredible understanding of the mechanics of how the body moves. So we've mentioned already that the Parthenon is Doric in terms of its exterior decoration, but some parts of the Parthenon are in fact Ionic. At this point in the classical period, in the high classical period, the Doric becomes used in some cases as an exterior order, an exterior set of decorative devices and conventions, and the Ionic is used as an interior order. And so that's what happens in the Parthenon. We have, on the inside of the structure, we have Ionic columns, and we also have, around the naos, or the cella, we have an Ionic frieze. And so this here is a detail, an example from the Panathenaic festival procession, which is part of this over 500-foot long frieze, which wrapped around the cella. So the Panathenaic festival was part of the process of really worshiping Athena. And on an annual basis, this enormous procession would take place through the city, which would then culminate up on the Parthenon and this ancient wooden statue of Athena, which, according to legend, had fallen from the sky, and which was kept in the Erechtheion, would be given a new peplos, a new woolen garment, as part of the ceremony. When we look at the Panathenaic festival frieze, it really begins with this flurry of activity, with men on horseback. We can see the motion and the vitality, and then we see things kind of slow to a walk, as you can see in this panel here. And as we move on even farther, and we look at the next one here, we can see we have seated figures. So it kind of slows down as it moves along, and it moves from people on horseback, and eventually here we have gods and goddesses and other important people here on the east frieze. Another view here, we can see the exterior of the Parthenon. You can also see how it sits up on a raised platform. And you can also see the damage that was done to the center of the structure when it was blown out by an artillery shell. There's ongoing restoration that takes place there. Funding is always an issue, but people have over decades been working to very carefully and painstakingly restore and rebuild many of the features of this structure. There's a couple of artist drawings and reconstructions that give you an idea of how things would have appeared. Again, we have the 8 columns across the front. We have the 17 across the long axis. And this, of course, reflects the ratio that we talked about previously of x equals 2y plus 1. Here you can get an idea, really, of how the structure was created and shaped. You can see on the top that it includes a full peristyle. Then we have, of course, the inner sanctuary, the naos, where we would have found Ionic columns. It doesn't have a true opisthedomos. Actually, the structure was used as a way, as a treasury, really, to hold valuables and offerings to the gods. So the view here that we're looking at is from the Acropolis. We're actually up on the Acropolis and looking out towards the city through what is called the Propylaea. And the Propylaea was a gateway. This was the pathway you had to pass through in order to enter up onto the Acropolis proper. Now, there's some interesting things about the Propylaea, by the way. If you notice, you'll look that it has a stylobate on either side, but it's much lower in the center. And if you look carefully, and especially if you look up at the top, look at the abacus and echinus that you see on the columns on either side there of the opening, and you'll notice that the distance between the capitals of the columns changes. So look at the columns on the left, the columns on the right, look at the spacing, and then look at the spacing in the middle, and you'll see it's much, much larger. And the reason for this much larger space is because this is where the chariots would pass through a ramp as they came up onto the site, onto the Acropolis. Attached to the Propylaea, by the way, was an incredibly important building, the first of its kind, the first known example of this. The Greeks called it a pentakotheke, or picture gallery. And this was essentially our first known example of a museum. Now, we don't know if that was its original function, but we do know that at least during Roman times, that's what it was used for. So another one of the unusual structures that survives today that we can see when we look at the Acropolis is a building called the Erechtheion. And this is a really unusual building. Typically when we talk about Greek architecture, we expect to see all this symmetry and balance and proportion. And this is a really oddly shaped building. And the reason for this, in truth, is because it's designed with a specific site in mind. It had to be built here, on this location. And the location isn't level. And so rather than leveling the site, the Greeks built the temple around, really, what they needed to do in terms of accommodating the location. Because this is the site of the sacred rock where Poseidon strikes his trident. It's where the olive tree grows up. And so this is site-specific architecture. It's also intended for the worship of multiple deities. So for all of these reasons, it's really quite unusual and really quite asymmetrical, which is very unusual in terms of Greek temple design. And again, we talked a little bit already about the legend here, about where this comes from. It's also named after the king Erechtheus, who was a very early Athenian king. And it was during his reign that the ancient statue of Athena fell from the sky, and again was housed here in the Erechtheion. Another view of the Erechtheion here, and you can see the height differences. If you look on the right, you can see that it is much shorter, and then on the left-hand side, you can see how much lower the structure goes and how much taller those columns are on the far left. The most famous feature of the Erechtheion is a porch called the Porch of the Maidens. And here you can see this Ionic-styled structure that projects out from the building. And here the columns are replaced with the traditional, the traditional Ionic column really has been replaced with a caryatid. And so these again are columns in the form of a woman. They're in the shape of a female figure. Now, unfortunately, these are all copies. The originals no longer survive on site. But we do have some originals, of course, which remain today in the British Museum. Another example here, again, you can see the restored view and get an idea of how these worked. You can see the contrapposto, and you can see how these female figures were used to support the roof. So this is one of the originals. This is in the British Museum, and you can see how these would have appeared originally. So a final building that we're going to look at and discuss from the Acropolis is a structure called the Temple of Athena Nike. And this is a view from the northeast. So basically, if you were standing in the Propylaea and walking out, this is what you would see to your left. And the stonework down below, by the way, is the remains of a Mycenaean bastion. Once again, this is a structure that was much older, and this is built up on top. So this is what is called a amphiprostyle temple. So it's a temple that has colonnades on the front and back, but does not have a full peristyle. So it's a small temple, and again, a temple to the goddess of victory, which again is another incarnation of Athena. One of the overarching themes, by the way, one of the overarching ideas and concepts behind all of this, behind representing Gigantomachy and Amazonomachy and Centauromachy, and Athena holding, Nike within the temple, the Parthenon. All of this really relates back to one concept. It is all a symbolic reference to the Greek victory over the Persians. In each of these cases, really, the Amazons represent the Persians, the centaurs represent the Persians, the giants represent the Persians. And so it's intended to symbolically, to metaphorically, again, restate the victory of really Athens more than anything else over the Persians. But this here is specifically a temple to victory, a temple to Nike. Around 410 BCE, there was a parapet built around this bastion, around this structure, which had various relief images of Nike. But again, this was intended to refer to, and in fact, part of the frieze here chronicles the victory of the Greeks over the Persians at Marathon. Another view here, again, of the Temple of Athena Nike. You can see the frieze above. You can also see that this is, in fact, an Ionic temple. So here's a view looking up onto the Propylaea from the Acropolis. And you can see the ramp that works its way up. You can see the Temple of Athena Nike on the right-hand side up above there. And this is what it looks like today. This is an example of how it appears now. On this next slide, we can see how it probably looked back in the day, during the age of these ancient Greeks. Of course, this was after the death of Pericles, but during, again, this golden age where we have the creation of all these structures. This is probably how it appeared. One of the surviving panels from the Temple of Athena Nike, from the parapet, is this image here of Athena, or Nike rather, tying her shoe. What's really so amazing about this, what's striking about this, is that, tying your shoe tends to be kind of a clumsy, ungainly, and certainly less than beautiful activity. But somehow here, the architect of this structure, the artist rather, of this panel, I should say, the artist here, has managed to create this image, this reference of beauty, of perfection, of balance, in rendering what is really an ungainly activity. We have one of Nike's wings extending outward to balance as she just reaches down and ties this shoe. We also have this incredible sense of beautiful drapery, almost soaking wet drapery, as it's translucent and drenched in water as it hangs on her figure. And we have this incredible sense of sculptural detail and decoration. So this is an example from the Dipylon Cemetery in Athens. And we're moving away from the Acropolis here and talking about some different items. But this is a really interesting contrast. So this particular object that you're looking at it's a gravestone, really. It's a stone of Hegeso from the Dipylon Cemetery. And on first glance, you might look at this and think that, it's some kind of a touching scene between family members, but there's actually something else going on here. First off, I should identify that the figure that's seated is Hegeso, who was a young lady, and Hegeso died fairly young. She died before she was married. And so you might notice, by the way, if you look carefully, that Hegeso is really quite a bit larger than the other woman in the picture. There's a good reason for this. It's actually a use of hierarchical scale. In this case, the woman on the left is not Hegeso's family member or friend, but is in fact a slave, a servant. And rather than looking at a touching scene, what you're actually seeing here is Hegeso looking at her jewelry box and choosing. She's picking something beautiful to wear. And so this is not actually a scene that's a touching scene between two women, but in fact instead is an image of a woman and her property. And the slave is included in that. She is part of the property. So this is actually kind of an interesting statement. See, because this woman died young, she died before she could marry, and this would have been commissioned by her family. And so what this really is about, more than anything, it's about the wealth of the family. It's about really showing that this woman was died before she could offer a dowry. And so this is kind of an intended subject to show the dowry that the father would have paid to a husband, even though no husband is pictured. Now, we've talked a little bit already about the fact that many of the examples of famous Greek statuary we look at are no longer originals, that we're really oftentimes looking at reproductions, at copies. And this one right here is one of the most infamous of these, really, in that it's actually cobbled together from several different copies. But what's really kind of ironic about this is that it is a copy, a representation of what is believed to be really one of the most just strikingly beautiful statues in history. This is a copy of a famous example that would have been created by the artist Praxiteles. Praxiteles was renowned for his ability to create this just beautiful, sensuous, subtle, beautiful, vibrant flesh. And one of his most famous works was this incredibly beautiful image of Aphrodite of Knidos. And this was really a controversial statue. You may remember when we talked about Koros and Kore figures, men are always nude and women are never nude. Well, what he does here that's quite remarkable is that Praxiteles represents a goddess naked. And even for the Greeks, this was a big deal. We would often see images of nudity and sexuality in small-scale things, in pottery and other things that would be kept in the house, but not in a 6'8" statue that would be out for public display. It's a very different thing. And so this statue, this image of Aphrodite, shows her coming out of the bath. She's got a giant pitcher of water there. She's got her garment, her drapery, and she's kind of, demurely, stepping out. This was really quite a sensation. This was quite a controversial artwork when it was created, because again, female nudity was really quite rare in Greek art. And even then, when it was done, it was often slave women or courtesans, but not goddesses. And so that was really quite a shock as well. The original of this was really well known for its dewy eyes, for its radiant lifelike flesh. And again, we don't see that quite to the same degree here. During this period in history, by the way, we also see the Peloponnesian War occurring, which lasts from about 431 to 404 BCE, and ends in the complete defeat of the Athenians at the hands of the Spartans. But the Spartans don't really do a good job of running the city, and eventually it reverts back to Greek control. We also see the Greeks reunify holistically as a group to fight up against the Macedonians, but then they lose. The king of the Macedonians, Philip II, later is assassinated and then succeeded by his son, Alexander, who later becomes known, of course, as Alexander the Great. Another example here, which is an example of the Praxitelean style, is from Chios in Greece. And this is also made from marble. It's about 1 foot 2 inches in height. And this sculptor, while not believed to actually be Praxiteles himself, certainly worked in the Praxitelean manner, in this very suggestive softness of the skin and the eyes, and it really a very sensuous image. And this gives us a little better idea of how the Aphrodite of Knidos probably would have looked. This example here is sometimes attributed to Praxiteles, but we don't really know. This is probably a marble copy of an original. And Praxiteles did work in marble. This was originally believed at one point to be by the master's hand, but is now believed really to just be a very high-quality copy. But this is a rendition of Praxiteles' Hermes and the infant Dionysus from the Temple of Hera at Olympia. And kind of interesting story behind this one, too. This is about the escape from the wrath of Hera, really, of the baby Dionysus. So, Dionysus was born by Zeus from another woman, and so obviously Hera would not have been happy about this. And so Zeus sends Dionysus off with Hermes. Hermes takes him to be raised by a satyr by the name of Papaselenos. And this was basically part of them fleeing. And so originally here, Hermes would have had a bundle of grapes above. He was holding over his head and dangling over the baby for Dionysus to reach up to. But this again is a beautiful rendition and shows us some idea, really, of the lifelike character that we probably would have seen in the original works by Praxiteles. So the example here is another grave stele like that we saw of Hegesto, but this one's a little bit more emotional, a little more touching, I think. You're looking at a grave stele here, which represents, you can see several different figures. And so we see, if we look carefully, we can see really there's 4 people. We have an old man, a young boy, a young man, or an adult, really, and a dog. And so the first question you might ask is, well, who is dead? Who are we talking about? Well, actually, it's rather apparent here if you know what to look for. So first off, you have the old man who's looking at, looking inward. You have the young boy who's obviously weeping, and the dog who, I don't know how you express the kind of emotion with the dog, but the dog is intended to be kind of forlorn looking as well. But then the other figure, the adult male, you can see here, this young man, is making eye contact with us. He's looking out of the composition. And that's because he is the guy who's the deceased. He's dead. He's the one who died. And so he's looking out at us, creating this emotional bridge. And the other figures that you see, the other characters that you see here, are his family. You see his son and his father, and of course his dog. So we've already previously seen an example of a canon, of an artist, a sculptor who had really looked carefully at the human figure and attempted to create a very serious sense of proportion and ratios. Well, another artist who does this is a late classical sculptor by the name of Lysippos. So once again here we're looking at a Roman copy of what would have been a bronze original from about 330 BC. And this bronze copy is located in the Vatican, and it's about 6'9". Lysippos created, again, this new canon of proportions, and he was so well known, so famous for his abilities, that he was actually chosen by Alexander the Great to be his official sculptor and did portraits of him. And his new set of proportions can be seen here in this work called the Apoxiomenos, or the scraper. And here we see this athlete who would be scraping the olive oil from his body. The proportions are remarkable, but we also have this incredible sense of energy and activity within the figure. It breaks away from the formal frontal tradition that we still tend to see in the Doryphoros, and it really can only be understood and appreciated by walking around it, looking at it from different angles. By the way, you may notice that certain parts of his anatomy here are covered with a leaf. But if we look here at the next example, you can see it's been restored. Now that's the same artwork, the exact same image, same work, but after restoration. It's kind of a funny story, but many of the Greek statuary works in the Vatican Museum at one point were demasculated, it's basically this was something that was done under the reign of one of the popes, and many of these have since been restored. So here's a comparison between the two. Here we can see the Doryphoros, the spear barrel by Polykletos, and on the right-hand side we can see the Apoxiomenos, or scraper, by Lysippos. And we can see how these differ so tremendously in terms of proportion, in terms of activity and energy. But again, you can see how the human figure shifts and changes here. The Doryphoros is much heavier, squatter, and uses a different system of proportions. And you can see that the head is much smaller, for example, in the Apoxiomenos on the right. A final example that we're going to look at is another work by Lysippos. And this is one of his best known pieces. This is the Weary Heracles, again a Roman copy here. And this copy we know was created by Glycon of Athens. So the original again would have been bronze, and this is a massive statue. It is 10 foot 5 inches in height. This would have originally, this copy anyway, would have been found in the baths of Caracalla. And in order to really understand this work, you actually have to walk all the way around it because you can't see enough to understand it from one view. But this is Heracles after completing his labors. He's so tired, so dejected, he can barely stand, leaning here against his club. And behind his back, he's holding the apples of the Hesperides. So instead of showing glory and satisfaction at his victory here, he's shown in a moment of just complete exhaustion. And here in this image we can see the back side and get an idea of the rear of the statue here, and you can see the apples in his hands.